So welcome everybody to our November meeting, our Remembrance Day meeting, I guess we can call it, even though it's a little early. So this is our agenda for the evening. So one of the first things we do at our meetings, for anybody who's not been before, is we check for first-time attendees, and then we grill you. Well, no, we're very nice about it. We do ask for your name and some of the surnames you're researching, so that we can see if there's a cousin in the audience. It's happened many times. So, who's here for the first time? Just our speaker. So Bryan, are you interested in genealogy at all? Do you do your family history?
I'm researching two names in my own family at this moment. My mother's name is Crawford.
Crawford?
From Ayrshire, southern Scotland. And I'm determined that I'm a direct descendant of one of Scotland's 19th century military heroes, great-great-great-nephew by 9 extractions, Major General Robert Black Bob Crawford.
Black Bob Crawford. Oh, I like this.
Yeah, Black Bob, who known apparently famously for his language, which apparently was not exactly Queen's English, and secondly, he was one of Wellington's favorites in the Peninsular War. Fought in Spain between 1807 and 1812. He died, apparently, as one would like to think of one's ancestor, in some horrible frolic against a Spanish fort in 1812. On my mom's side, and on my mother's other side, she has a German ancestry, Keffer.
Keffer?
Yeah, a lot of different spellings. Hers is Keiffer, but there's a lot of variations. And they were descended from people in Linz, Austria, near the border of Germany and Austria. And we've been able to trace back some really interesting work with them in the 1600s. So
Marion Keffer was one of the founding members of the Ontario Genealogical Society. So, oh, here we go. We have a part Keffer here.
My grandmother.
Okay, her grandmother. So you have to compare notes.
We will.
But doesn't sound like the same region.
We've got some of that in our fridge.
So there's a sheet at the back, Bryan, if you want to put your names down. If we run across those names from someone else, we'll let you know. So I'm just going to reiterate, and I'll probably reiterate this for several meetings, is there are the different parking areas around the church. We've got parking on the side streets, and there's 2 parking lots that are within walking distance. And those people with accessibility stickers is apparently what they're really called. We'd like to keep the main parking lot outside for them. Good news! I got updated as I came in. Reverend Sandra's at the door, and she was telling me that they've got wiring in for the lights, and they've taken down the old ceiling, and they're going to put the drywall up soon and mud it, and then they're going to be ready to paint the room. So we may actually get in this year. Possibly. We'll keep our fingers crossed. It'll be nice to get our 150 boxes unpacked. Currently they're lining the back end of the gym, so I think there's been a few basketball bounces that have gone astray because of hitting a box of ours. So I'm going to spend a few slides here on the 2019 membership renewals and or new memberships. There's quite a bit going on here. Something new this year is there's no January grace period. If you don't renew by December 31st, you won't be able to get into the members only area. So they're asking that you do renew before then. They've also gotten rid of the family membership. But if you're currently a family membership and you renew before the end of the year, you're grandfathered and you can keep going. They're not giving out any new ones. Now, returning this year is the Grow Our Family offer. Okay, I lost some resolution there, didn't I? So, the deal is that if you're brand new or a returning member who was not a member in 2017 and 2018, and you find a partner who's a current member who's going to renew, get together and get a code, and you'll both of you get 50% off. So there's an incentive for current members to sponsor somebody. And if someone here is looking to join OGS, this is the way to do it. It saves you $31.50. In addition to that, they've got early bird prizes. Now, let me go back on that one. There we go. My item there that came out really, okay. It applies from November 1st to December 15th at 5 p.m. So you got 6 weeks, okay? The early bird prize offer is valid if you complete your renewal by 5 o'clock November 30th. And they've got some really darn good prizes that have been donated. Some DNA kits, some subscriptions to different websites, some of the family tree maker programs, membership reimbursements, books. So, well worth renewing before November 30th. And Joyce told me she's renewed today. And in case you wonder why you should join Ontario Genealogical Society, here's a few of the benefits, and I'd just like to highlight 2 at the bottom. 15% off of choice hotels. So that includes comfort suites, Clarion, Quality Inns, that type. 15% off is pretty nice. And Your Genealogy Today is a magazine from Moorshead Magazines, and it used to be called Family Chronicle. So that's $10 a year is a pretty good subscription price. And it's quite a thick magazine, so well worth getting that. Moving on, I went to a historical panel this past weekend at the Oshawa Public Library. And Laura Sushan from the Oshawa Museum told us that every extant newspaper in Oshawa, which if you don't know, there was a big fire, I think it was about 1972, that destroyed a lot of the papers. But over the years, the Oshawa Museum has collected bits and pieces. So everything has been digitized and has been put up on this website, the Canadian Community Digital Archives. The website is actually called, leave off the Canadian, communitydigitalarchives.com. So right on this, you can see the Daily Clarion and the Ontario Reformer, and I saw at least another 5 scrolling down the page, that bits and pieces from the different Oshawa newspapers. So hopefully it'll fill in a little bit.
Do you have to have a membership with that library? No?
No, as far as I'm aware, not.
I just saw sign in, but that might be.
Yeah, I didn't actually sign in, so I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure that Laura said it was free access. Here's something that's really nice for the Remembrance Day. Free access to Canadian military records at ancestry.ca, November 8th to the 11th. And if you're already an ancestry.ca subscriber, you get access to Fold3 and newspapers.com. And
To get the free access, do you have to give them your credit card?
I believe not, but you have to set up an account.
Yeah, I think I have one already.
Probably.
Yeah.
Most of us do. And because we're coming up gradually on the American Thanksgiving, a lot of the DNA companies are starting to do bargains on their tests. So keep an eye on DNAbargains.com. Currently, there's an Ancestry DNA deal out there, and 23andMe have a deal. If you're looking for one of the other 2 or 3 companies, just keep an eye on DNAbargains.com. Now, scrolling by things, I found a commercial on the TV for the History Channel on a Sunday from 9 to 11 p.m., 2-hour special, the 100 Days to Victory. So it's World War I. So that could be an interesting special to watch.
Is that TVO?
History Channel.
We don't.
Okay, because TVO is running specials too.
Could very well be, but this was, the commercial I saw was for History Channel. And the 1926 census of the Prairie provinces has been indexed between Library and Archives Canada and Family Search. So they're just doing quality checks now, and they hope to have the database online by March. So that's pretty good news.
Question?
Yeah.
If it's Family Search doing it, is it going to be free, or is it, you have to have?
It'll be, I believe it's going to go up on Library and Archives Canada
So
for
you don't
free.
have to have an account with Family Search?
I don't think so.
What am I thinking? Never mind, I'm thinking of a different.
Family Search is free,
anyway, yeah.
but you do have to have an account in order to get on it, so, yes.
I was thinking of a different one, sorry.
No, it's not Ancestry that's going to charge you money. Family Search is free. So at this point, I'm going to hand this over to Steve, because it's November, and that's annual elections time. I got a couple of slides there. One with the elected positions, and then one with volunteer positions.
Oh, thanks. Well, thank you, Nancy. There's not too many people here tonight, so that's not a real great indication of how things may go, if in past years or anything to judge. But these are the 4 elected positions that we have to do tonight: chair, vice chair, secretary, and treasurer. The vice chair, of course, doesn't have a lot of work to do at the moment. The idea is that they learn and are able to take over from the chair in a couple of years when they step down. Secretary, she takes the mail that comes into the branch.
No.
Have I got the wrong one again?
Recording secretary.
Recording secretary. Okay, I got it backwards again.
Yes.
Yeah.
We actually have 2 secretaries, a recording secretary and then a correspondence secretary. And I've got it, so it is the recording secretary that we do
Because
need.
he takes the official minutes.
He or she, that's right, takes the minutes of preferably this meeting and of our exec meetings. So they have about 2 meetings a month times about 11 months of the year. We don't meet in the summertime. And of course, treasurer, that's the fun job. You get to play with all our money.
You get to keep any?
There is a problem there, yes.
If you do, we aren't happy with you.
Yeah, that's right. And so these are the 4 positions. So we'll start with the position of chair. We have had no nominations that have been handed in for the appointment of chair, other than Nancy has indicated, should the occasion arise, she is willing to stay on for another year. So I will open the floor to anyone who wants to nominate someone for the position of chair, or if you want to nominate yourself, we do accept that as well. So we'll go for 3 tries here. Is there anyone from the floor? Or do we have any nominations or volunteers for the position of chair? Going once. How about going twice? Anybody second guessing this, or anybody interested? Go 3 times, 3rd call. Well, Nancy, I do believe you are elected again. Congratulations and thank you very much. You're going to be sick of us for
This will be year 5.
yeah. Vice chair. We are looking for nominations for that position as well. Again, not a lot of work. You just learn from Nancy and the rest of the group, and hopefully you are running the group in a couple of years or so. And it is a year at a time, so you don't have to commit for 10 years or anything like that. Just Nancy.
No. It's not gonna be 10
No.
years.
But are there any nominations or volunteers from the floor for vice chair?
Well, Steve, you're retired now.
I'm still past chair.
Yeah, but if you move up in my spot, I'll be past chair.
Going once. Going twice.
Yeah.
3rd call for vice chair. Your executive will try and find someone and appoint them later for the vice position of
Somebody
vice
can come
chair.
along later and say, they could also come along later and say, oh, I've changed my mind, I'd like to look
That
into
is
this.
true, yes. If you think about it, we actually asked a couple months ago and last month, and we were hoping you were thinking about it already, but we do take latecomers. Okay, recording secretary. Again, this is a vital job, and basically your executive have been taking turns doing the position whenever we're having a meeting. So is there any nominations or volunteers from the floor for position of secretary corresponding? Or, no, I did it again, sorry, B. Recording. I'm gonna get B doing both, that's all.
Yeah, that's what it is.
That's what it is.
I'm not here all the time.
Going twice. 3rd time's a charm. Okay, again, your executive will attempt to fill that position as we go along. Now, of course, these positions don't actually start until January, so if you wanted Christmas off, we can give you this Christmas off. Did that sweeten the pot at all? Okay, treasurer. We have had no applications or anything for treasurer, although Sheila has indicated that should no one else be interested in the position, she is willing to continue on with that position. So, any volunteers or
Twisted arms?
twisted arms from the floor?
We should have a position called junior treasurer. Learning the ropes.
We could
Well-
certainly do that.
Yeah, we definitely do help you along. I mean, Don is still
He's member at large now.
member at large, and he's still the
Backup
backup treasurer, yeah.
Yeah.
Going once. Twice. No one likes counting money? 3 times. And Sheila, thank you very much. We do appreciate all your help and continuing to stay on in the position. And I believe, and I hit the wrong button, didn't
Oh, there it
Oh,
is, Steve, it's
I? It's
coming.
just,
It's just slow,
I hit the
Oh.
wrong button probably to,
yeah. Right button.
Go the other way maybe?
Yeah.
well, it should be there somewhere, but,
No, that was the slide before.
oh, was there a blank one?
Yeah, so you're going the right way now. Keep one more. There we go.
There we go. There are volunteer positions in the branch we would also like to fill.
We would badly like to fill these because they've been empty far too long.
We need someone to help us with our newsletter, preferably someone in charge that can coordinate everything. Anne currently is assembling the newsletter for us, but she does not like bugging people to get your articles in and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we would like a newsletter editor if we can get one. This is a volunteer position. Pay is the same as the rest of us. Very poor. Also the Education Committee. That we had started a while back trying to get ourselves out into the public eye and also to help educate not only ourselves but anyone else that was interested in it. We do run a program once a year at the moment for education, like it's a one-day mini seminar or mini conference, whatever you want to call it. And but sometimes we do have some other things. So if you're interested in helping to get the word for genealogy out there, please come and see us. We need people on the committee and one person to run it as well. And last but not least, refreshments. As you know, we try and have drinks and maybe some cookies or something for all our meetings. We did have coffee, but that got to be a little too big of a challenge because we didn't have anybody doing this. We just, the odd executive member has been bringing in cookies or drinks or whichever as we go along. But if we had someone in charge of that intended on coming out to most of the meetings, we can always cover you if you're not, if you go south for a couple months in the winter or whatever, that's not a problem. But if somebody would be interested in taking charge of the refreshments, that would be great help as well. Once we get our office upstairs, the idea is most of the stuff can be stored up there and we just bring it downstairs for the meetings. So, except for maybe the cookies, they might get a little stale. But we're hoping to streamline it a little bit better as time goes on, but at the moment we kind of bring them in from home. So if anyone is interested in that position, please see someone on the executive or any of these three positions. Or even if you just want to be a member at large and kind of learn slowly and get to know us all and et cetera, we're always willing to have more people on the executive committee. See Ann or Nancy or Dan or myself or anyone else. Bee's over there and Dawn's over there and Joyce is sitting there. Please see us. And thank you, and we move on, and I'm going to hit the wrong thing again, aren't I? There we go. That worked.
Okay. Okay. So, correspondence, Bree's got a couple for us.
Yeah,
We've got mail.
yeah, not a lot, but we got mail. These have come in via email. Remember the date. One came in on the 10th of October, and it's from Jack Sorba. I'm wondering if anyone can help me with my great-great-grandfather, Patrick Sheridan, born in 1831 in Galloway, Ireland, married Catherine Riordan, born in 1831 in Ireland, County Cork. They came to Canada approximately in 1850s. I've been to St. Gregory's Cemetery and found many of my family members there, even my great-great-grandmother, Catherine Riordan. Sheridan, of course. My problem is my great-great-grandfather's Patrick's stone is not there. I'm wondering if his stone was one of the ones that got destroyed when the cemetery was vandalized by several teenagers a few years ago. If my great-great-grandfather's stone was destroyed, are there any records that he's buried there? Beside Catherine, and would they have the year he was born till his death date and know exactly what was on the stone? I've been to that cemetery and there's ample room for Patrick to be buried there by his wife, and I've not found him in any other cemetery. Is there a way to find out what happened to him and where he is buried? I'm sure he's buried by his wife. Thank you for any help you can give me. I'm looking forward to hearing from you again. Laura Sheridan Sorba, although it came from Jack Sorba at Belknap. The next one came in on the 21st of October, and it says, I'm working on trying to find out what happened to my grandfather, John Thomas Anderson. I know that his name appears on a headstone in DeWitt's Cemetery this way. Anderson, Mary Elizabeth Bruce, December 28, 1891, excuse me, to April 22nd, 1970, wife of John T. Anderson. I did manage to find these details. Excuse me. John T. Anderson, burial, DeWitt's Family Cemetery, Blackstock, Durham Regional Municipality, Ontario, Canada, Memorial ID 15, on with the number. Would you be able to tell me the significance of the Memorial ID? Is there a document where I can find to see why his name is on the stone too? He disappeared many years earlier, and I'm trying to find out where he died and actually was buried. Excuse me, that comes from Jane Anderson.
It sounds like she got it off Find a Grave and it's their memorial number.
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably she doesn't say though.
Referring to the first one, I had a similar thing, and the stone was completely buried. We knew where it was, but that's in Newmarket. But I dealt with the church.
Yeah.
The church is very, you'll find the church online, and the I just, I think I phoned them. They had an answering machine.
They had an answering machine at the church?
They wouldn't take a penny, and in the end, they dug it up.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't.
Now, Devitt's is just a small one,
Very small cemetery.
very small cemetery, and
So is there a church?
there's no church there.
Well, that was the St. George's.
The first one, St. Gregory's.
St. Gregory's.
Gregory's.
Yeah.
You have a
St.
chance at a
Gregory's.
church
And
there,
there is a stone, but nothing that says,
that he's buried there,
that's right.
yeah.
But
But Devitt's the second
but
one.
they would have records in the church.
Yeah.
If that's how I.
They should
well,
ask
I
the
found
church
a
for
record
burial
before.
records.
Well, I forwarded it
And
to
if
Steve again, so.
If it's
Yeah.
been buried, it's better.
Yeah.
It's
Actually,
in
you've
great
got,
shape.
the stone is in good shape if it's been buried for a while, you're right. And?
If there was vandalism there, we don't know how long ago that was, but our transcriptions are not recent for
Yeah.
that cemetery.
I'm
so-
sure Steve will check that when he hands it
Yeah,
over.
it was forwarded to Steve and Deb, so.
Yeah.
Nancy, actually too, what Steve, as Steve's gonna check it out, is check with the funeral parlor to see who they get a hold of to put a burial there. They'll give you a name and number, and
So,
then they can look it up in
Yeah.
the records.
funeral home, if we can figure out which funeral parlor does most of the burials at St. Gregory's, that's another option. Yeah, Armstrong's is big enough.
No, but what I heard was Armstrong's do a lot of the Catholic.
Okay, Armstrong's does a lot of the Catholics, so that's an option. I'm sure Steve will mention that. Okay, Sheila, do we have a treasurer's report? Because I don't think we did one last month, did we? We left most of the time for our speaker.
I just brought the current.
Okay, that's
Okay, so this is the report for today, the current account. Withdrawals in the past 30 days was $303.10. Deposits were $344.83. So our balance is $3,613.01.
Oh, gee, maybe you can take the 1 cent and make it even.
It'll go somewhere.
Treasurers get all the pennies that they get turned in, okay?
Oh, that's nice.
Oh, I should have announced that. It's part of
Yes,
the
exactly.
bonus.
So what we'll do is, we'll take our break now while we set up for our speakers. So come back maybe, what, 20 after? Does that sound reasonable?
Not quarter after. But there's not much to do, so bump it back.
Okay.
There are a few little handouts on the front table to look at. They're not to take home, but you can look at the handouts that are on the front table there if you're interested. Yeah, they will get into our library eventually.
No, they actually extended the deadline.
Yes, they did.
Yeah, to the 15th, wasn't it? Okay.
And the memberships have opened up for November 1st.
Okay, one other item while you're wandering around. We have a travel tour that's set up by the provincial branch, and it's to go to Salt Lake City for research, and if you pay the money for the registration, the Roots Tech 2019, which is a humongous conference, and it's lots of fun. I've been twice now, and it's just incredible. At the top, it says the deadline's October 30th. It's actually now been extended to November 15th, so they're still accepting members to go on the tour group.
There are a few articles on the back table there that are, you can take one if you want and put a small donation in our box.
So, where'd Brian go? So, Brian? We're going to restart now. If you could take your seats.
You might want to raise that mic.
I think, yeah. How high should I make it, Brian?
I'm not a microphone person, it's okay.
You're gonna yell?
I'll be fine.
Okay. I guess I need it down a little bit. Okay. So I'd like to introduce Bryan Davies, who is our speaker tonight. Bryan is a writer and military history enthusiast. He's based in Whitby. Bryan has lived in or near Durham region since childhood. He was educated at Appleby College in Oakville, the University of Toronto, and the Western University Faculty of Law. Bryan first gained North American recognition for his writing, research, and creative talents as a key contributor to the award-winning Lerner Global Media In Context Natural and Applied Sciences textbook series. Now say that rapidly 3 times.
My publisher wrote that, not me.
Okay. In 2017, Bryan and Andrew, now is he Traficante?
Yes.
Okay. Co-authored their first World War I nonfiction work, which is A Boy from Botwood, Private A.W. Manuel Royal Newfoundland Regiment, 1914 to 1919. Published by Dundering Press, and it was named by CBC Books as a must-read Canadian war story. 2 more Bryan and Andrew Canadian military histories will be published by Dundering in 2019. They also created the Sault Ste. Marie Virtual Museum of Canada online exhibit commissioned by the Canadian government. Bryan is currently leading a Canadian-UK research and writing team that is assembling a first ever full biography of one of Britain's most notable World War II figures, the pioneering Scottish developer of radar, Sir Robert Watson Watt, described by Winston Churchill as the man who saved a nation during the 1940 Battle of Britain. Under the Radar, The Secret Life of Sir Robert Watson Watt will be published in Canada and the UK in November 2019. So welcome, Bryan. Come on up, don't be shy.
Thank you very much. I'm not much of a microphone person as the opportunity allows. And as I said, my publisher wrote that stuff. My wife was here, she'd die laughing. But it is an honor for me to speak to you tonight. I welcome any opportunity that I ever get to speak to community groups and speak to people who have the same affection and passion that I do for history in its many and wonderful forms. And the first part of my talk tonight is, it's not flippant, it's not quite as flippant as that title might suggest. There is actually a message to that. I'm an inveterate Monty Python's Flying Circus fan, and a tribute to my late father, who was born in London in 1936, who encouraged me at the age of 10 to watch all the Monty Python episodes to really learn something about life. I think I did. But in the title and my little flippancy there, now there really is a message. I am honored to speak to you. And as I say, the first part of what I'm going to talk about is more about my own adventures through the side door with respect to genealogy. The second part of what I'd like to speak to you about tonight is more attuned to what this week is about in this country. Working up to Remembrance Day on Saturday, and my own view, which is that Remembrance Day and the few days that precede it are probably the most important days in our country's sort of cycle of events throughout the year. July 1st is great. It's a celebration of what we are. I grew up reading the Sir John A. Macdonald biographies and the founding of Canada, and I believe today I'm not a big fan of some of the revisionist histories that have gone on with my old hero Sir John, but those are celebrations. Remembrance Day and these days in advance of it speak to our soul as a nation. They speak to who we are, and they speak to the sacrifices and the commitments that people have made. They also speak, as I've noted other times and other places with groups such as yourselves, they speak to our failures as a nation too, and the things that we didn't do very well. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I close. But this title, Life of Bryan, that's me, and a flawed military historian's search for genealogical redemption. Why that title? When I was 10, my mom gave me a book. My mother, as I mentioned a few moments ago, her maiden name was Crawford, but her grandma, my beloved grandmother Crawford, was a Keffer. And the Keffers were part of that wonderful emigration in the face of the American Revolution, 1776. Some of you, I'm sure, have known this history, that became the United Empire Loyalists of Ontario. There's a wonderful book, if you've ever happened to study that particular migration from Pennsylvania and New York to Toronto, called The Trail of the Black Walnut. If you ever have a chance to read it, it's a fabulous genealogical study about the many, many very tough, very committed German Americans who were loyal to King George and who moved to Toronto. My great-grandfather, by times 5, I think, Jacob Keffer, and his brother founded the Lutheran Church in Maple, Ontario in 1812. It's now a United Church in Maple. And I was thrilled to participate in the celebration of the 200th anniversary there a few years ago. And that book, The Trail of the Black Walnut, is one of the great books you will ever read. It's not written in sort of a flashy style, engaging sort of 21st century pyrotechnics or anything, but it's a fantastic study of people who in a pre-internet age really put the story together. We're all lucky here. We can research almost anything pretty quickly. Putting a book together 60 years ago from paper, scraps of notes in church basements and archives and whatnot, you have to take your hat to people like that. It was tough work. And I love the story. I got to read about my Keffer ancestors, and it was really binding on me. And I
Just love history, I always have. And worked through your writing career, and a few years ago, I was sitting, as all great stories are, minding my own business at a little place I hang out in north part of Whitby called Charlie Ronix when I need to edit something or have a beer, whatever I do. And anyway, a fellow comes up to me and he says, "Are you Bryan Davies?" I said, "Yeah," wondering, I don't know, CRA, police officer, I'm not sure who. But he says, "My name's David Manuel, and the guys in this bar say you're a great writer." I stopped there. The fellows who hang out at Charlie Ronix are wonderful people, don't get me wrong. The Toronto Sun sports section is a struggle for some of these guys. It's not a literary society by any means. But so I took that as a grain of salt. But he said, "Let me buy you a beer. I'm going to tell you the greatest story you've ever heard in your life about military history." Sure. Well, it was. We sat there for 2 hours. And he told me the story of his grandfather, a man named Arthur Manuel, who we later tried to memorialize in our book, A Boy from Botwood. And his grandfather, who grew up in Botwood, Newfoundland, tough and hard and rugged, who signed on with the Royal Newfoundland Regiment at age 18. And he didn't sign on for patriotism or because he wanted to fight for King George. He signed on because he was the 6th of 8 children, and he worked in a lumber mill for 6 years, and he didn't wear boots or gloves or protective equipment, and the war was an opportunity to get ahead. He served through what the Newfoundlanders called a triple, and that is the Dardanelles campaign where Winston Churchill thought he would get the underbelly of Europe through a campaign that ended up in disaster. Arthur Manuel served at the most horrid battle in the history of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, a place called Beaumont Hamel, on July 1st, 1916, where 801 men went over the top and 56 answered roll call the next morning. Manuel survived by the skin of his teeth, and you will not find a Newfoundlander today anywhere who knows that story, who does not have a tear in their eye. A testament, as a Newfoundlander would tell you, not to glory and not to valor, but to complete and utter military incompetence and disaster. Right? Again, remembrance has different meanings when you look at it from different perspectives. Manuel got well enough after his wounds to serve at Passchendaele, where he was captured and held as a German prisoner of war for 17 months. That's really the hook of our story. It's the only book, and I'm not bragging by any means, it's the only book that tells us any detailed story of any North American soldier who served serious time in a German prisoner of war camp. He served the first 6 months in an undocumented quote-unquote slave camp, escaped with a wild man named Brown from Australia, got to within a quarter mile of the Australian lines, or pardon me, the French lines, you hear the guns, was recaptured, sent back to his former POW camp, had part of his foot cut off with an axe in a fight with the commandant. It's a crazy story, and every inch of it is true, right? Which is one of the reasons that I love history, because I am in that camp that says the truth is stranger and often way better than fiction. And Manuel only told his story, like so many in the Great War, the war to end all wars, as you know. Never said a word about it. His medals, and he would have been entitled to them, from the Dardanelles campaign, Beaumont Hamel, the Somme, Passchendaele, he disposed of them. In 1978, he got in some mad fight with the pension people, Veterans Affairs, age 82. When he was retired, London, Ontario, stormed home, told his aged wife, "I'm going to tell my story." They only knew he'd served in the war. He had said nothing, ever, about his life. He'd only been back to Newfoundland twice in that time. And he bought a dictaphone in 1979. Those of us remember the original dictaphone, this big clumsy thing. He dictated 60 hours of his reminiscences. Having listened to it firsthand, all 60 hours is remarkable. He had the whole thing transcribed, 400 pages, single-spaced text. He was plainly going to publish it, we think. But he died in 1984, and grandson, David, who confronted me and Charlie Ronix there a few years ago, he discovered this when his own dad died in a shoebox. A bunch of tapes and a stack of papers. That's the stuff of history. And Andrew Trafficante and I had relatively little trouble in crafting a narrative to kind of support everything that this wonderful, wonderful gentleman who he died 35 years ago. I wish to God I'd met him. He was everything that is wonderful about the Newfoundland people. A contrarian. He was cited 9 times for insubordination as a soldier. He was never promoted. All those wonderful things that the Newfoundlanders hold near and dear. And I really wish I'd known him. But it took us another year to really piece together like a jigsaw puzzle, a stream of consciousness narrative out of 400 pages of single text. And it ended up in our book, and we're pride of authorship is a sin. I don't ascribe to it, all right? But we are proud of the fact that we were able to tell a story that has had a bit of modest acclaim. I fast forward to last summer when our publishers had us go on a book trip to Newfoundland, and it was wonderful. There is nothing quite like being the author of a book that people from Newfoundland embrace, that makes you a bit of a local hero for a minute or two anyway. And if I had a larger liver and a bigger constitution, it would have been even more fun, because the Newfoundland guys said, they like to have fun. It was wonderful. But the passion that came out of that story was terrific. It really gets to the bottom of my subtitle here. There we are. Wonderful time in Botwood, a town of 3,000, and 250 people came to hear what Andrew and I had to say about their guy, Arthur Manuel. It was one of the greatest moments of my life, I'm going to tell you. In September of last year, there was a mural painted on the wall of this is a library in Botwood, and they had all the best books ever published in Newfoundland. You can't quite see it there, but our book's right there. And I will tell you, that was a moving experience for me, because as you may know, if you know anything about Newfoundland, there are Newfoundlanders, and there are those of us from away. And I had an old fella tell me, well, you two fellas from away told a story about our boy, how dare you, kind of a thing. We warmed him over. But there I was, sort of sitting there, basking in the glory of our book launch and whatnot, and a nice lady walked up to me and said, I'm related to your hero. My name is Ingrid Manuel. I'm from just north of the town. And she said, you boys told a fantastic story. And I can't imitate the accent because it's just beautiful. But she said, don't think you didn't. But don't you think it would have been so much better had you had the genealogical piece about the family? And you see, back up a little bit. This man, I call him the villain. He's not a villain. This is Michael Bliss. Michael Bliss died last year, and I would stand up to anyone that he's one of the great historians in the history in this country. Michael Bliss, Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto, Order of Canada. His distinctions go forever. In his early life, he was an expert in Canadian business history, but he made his bones in his unbelievable book. If you ever have a chance to read it, it is the history of Banting and Best, the discoverers of insulin. It is a fantastic book. And Michael, God bless him, he died last year, is the only non-doctor who was ever entered into the British Royal Society of Physicians and Surgeons. That's the accord and the respect he had worldwide for his work with Banting and Best. He and I became friends through a crazy story that I won't bore you with. And he kind of decided he was going to mentor Andrew and I with respect to this book and our Sault Ste. Marie project that was kindly mentioned earlier. Michael uttered the faithful words to me that kind of resonate today with this group. Bryan, you guys have a terrific command of the narrative. We love the story. The Newfoundland thing's going to be great. The Sioux story, the history of Sault Ste. Marie, it's awesome. don't get into the genealogy. God. He says, it's a rabbit hole. It's a disaster. You'll never get out of it. Don't do it. Somebody's Aunt Maud's going to be sending you something on the email saying you got it wrong. Don't do it. And so, loyal guys, the great Bliss, there isn't really a whole lot of genealogy here. So I get back to Maud. Aunt Maud, and actually, lovely lady, Mrs. Manuel. Don't you think a genealogical piece would have been great for your book? And she then, just like on cue, whips out this 10-page, I've got it still, unbelievable history of the Manuel family of northern Newfoundland. Not just the Botwood manuals, of course. You've got the Fogo Island manuals, you've got the Twillingate manuals, you've got the Grand Harbor manuals, and God forbid, don't forget the St. John's manuals, Brian. They're a bit dodgy, but they're over here. And anyway, our book, not that bestseller status in Canada, it's not hard to attain. It's 5,000 copies of the book sold. But we are planning a second edition next year, and I promise you that Mrs. Manuel is going to get her due, because there will be an index, there will be a full-on genealogy that she's done, and it was brilliant. And so, my villain, I think it was Santayana, the Spanish philosopher, but certainly Winston Churchill made it famous, the saying that those who fail to study history are doomed to repeat it. And that's true in your own historical work. So I said to Andrew, okay, let's pay a little more attention to this genealogy work than maybe we did before. Well, wouldn't you know it, it just happened to play into our hands. And Falkenberg may not be a family that's known to you. And the Baron from Botwood. I won't get into the entire story, but it is unbelievable, but completely true, that this little town of 3,000 on the North Shore of Newfoundland, that in the First World War era would have been just a literal outpost of a fishing port, where it was rough and tough and hard scrabble life. But the man that Arthur Manuel in our book describes as that fat, pot-bellied Scandinavian son of a bitch who ran the lumber mill where he worked from a boy of 12, is actually the father of our hero of the second book, Falkenberg. He was the hereditary Swedish noble who the English owners brought in to run the lumber mill in Botwood. Amazing. But the genealogy piece of the Falkenbergs is completely remarkable. They moved to Quebec City when our hero in this book was 10. His name, Carl Falkenberg. And it is amazing, as I learned my lessons from book 1, how to really embrace genealogy. Some wonderful people in the Swedish ancestry world have traced the Falkenberg family back to the Rhine River about 500 AD. They have been hereditary nobles for 1,500 years. And our guy who grew up in Botwood and then moved to Quebec City is the descendant of that lineage. And it's a fantastic, I hope anyway, when the book it'll be published in July next year. I'm hoping that the Falkenberg backdrop and what we've tried to work out through the family really lends a certain zip and credence to what we try to say about his World War I story. And long story short, for Carl Falkenberg, he got wounded. He was part of the Canadian Expeditionary Force that came out of Quebec City in 1917. Wounded. And somebody said, gee, you and your brother, good shots. You should think about joining that Royal Flying Corps thing we're getting going now. You know? And Carl Falkenberg, in 3 months, became a World War I ace. He had 18 kills against the German Luftwaffe, or the then Luftwaffe. And he, in the Second War, was a wing commander with the Royal Canadian Air Force. Married a New York socialite. And the hook of the story on his side is that he, and why we have some interest from the Royal Air Force Museum and others in the UK, he physically participated in the autopsy, made 120 pages of notes of that autopsy, and can contribute to one of the great controversies of World War I, namely, who shot down the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. Falkenberg witnessed the dogfight in which Manfred von Richthofen was knocked down, and then because he was a nobleman and all that sort of thing, the Brits enlisted him to be an observer at this autopsy. I won't spoil it, it's a terrific story. But the backstory is just as important too, and it ties right to the genealogical piece, sort of modern day. His brother was shot down in his first mission, captured by German forces. And as you may know, any of you who studied World War I history, there was pretty decent reciprocity in those days. If you were a German or a British officer, you were treated well. British and German prisoner of war camps had symphonies, libraries. There were prisoner exchanges. It wasn't that tough. Not like when our enlisted boy went through in a slave camp just outside of Ingolstadt in Bavaria and lost 50 pounds of his weight. But Gerd Falkenberg, the brother, he had the awful fate of having a German-sounding surname, and he was treated abysmally, as the family story goes, and you piece it together through the family records and the notes, sort of modern-day genealogical study. He died a broken man, an alcoholic in 1951, and that's sort of the dark story that we get to tell as part of that World War I history that we learn. And I learned, working through this story the last couple of years, that genealogy can be an unbelievably powerful tool to probe deeply into the broader history. And I think Michael wouldn't mind if I called him that. Under the radar, my second genealogical lesson. Hang on a second. What I did there? Yeah, that's it. This is low tech. The gentleman in that statue there, good-looking fellow at the bottom there, isn't he? But the fellow in that statue is Sir Robert Watson Watt. The statue's remarkable. Brecon, Scotland. We who live in southern Ontario here would think of Brecon, a little village north of here. But the Scots pronounce it Brecon, about an hour and a half north of Dundee. And that statue, which is a remarkable, really remarkable statue, shows Watt. He's facing towards the house he was born in Brecon in 1892. And you can't quite see it. In one hand, he's holding a Spitfire fighter. In the other hand, he's holding a radar mast. And Watt was what your Breconers would call the bright laddie, who got out of their local schools. Andrew Carnegie Trust got him to university. Worked in the meteorological office for the Brits until 1925, and through a series of happenstances, figured out that the thunderstorms that he was tracking through radio waves could also detect aircraft. And in a brilliant sort of epiphany moment in 1935 at a place, Denzil, he proved to the British High Command that his radar waves could pick up aircraft. And the significance is, in 1932, Stanley Baldwin, the British Prime Minister, had said, the bomber will always get through in the next war if we will get destroyed. That was the very dark message. And Watt proved in a very antiquated way in 1935 that he could pick up aircraft 15 miles away. By 1939, it was 110 miles away. And these masts you see here, as you may know from any studies, ringed the coast of England all the way to Scotland. And when Winston Churchill described Watt as the man who saved the nation, he was not far off the mark, because without Watt, the 2,900 German aircraft against the 700 RAF, it would have been an obliteration. World War II would have been remarkably different. And this 5'6", self-described tubby man, our boy Watt, was the difference. How does a guy from Whitby get involved in this story is a legitimate question, but it has a unbelievably crazy and completely true background. Through a long series of happenstances, I've been a basketball coach for a long time. I missed a meeting and somebody made me the chairperson of the Ontario Basketball's Fair Play Committee. You missed 2 meetings, maybe you're king, not sure. But a wonderful friend of mine I met over the years there is a guy named Rick Parnham from Keswick, who's a referee, wonderful fellow. And this summer, he came up to visit me. My wife and I have a second house up in Sault Ste. Marie. And Rick came to visit. He's a great golfer and said, hey, we're having a second of our post-golf beverages. And he says, Brian, Son Blake inherited a bunch of stuff from his grandfather relates to Robert Watson Watt. You ever heard of him? I said, what, the developer radar? What? Keswick, Ontario? Are you kidding me? Yeah. Do you mind having a look at it? Of course. Well, second accident in Brian's great life about history. We have, without exaggeration, 5,000 pages of Robert Watson Watt's correspondence to people like Winston Churchill, Lord Beaverbrook, but most importantly, we have 10 years of his correspondence with his mistress that time, for 10 years, who became his wife in 1952, a Canadian lady named Jean Drew. The material and the insights and the extracts that we can pull from that material is gold to any historian. And we are, without having my publisher kill me for giving away great secrets as we advance this book towards next year's publication, we will be able to say something about this guy, who is revered as one of the four most famous people on sort of the non-military leadership side of World War II for the Brits, that he had a role throughout the Cold War as an unofficial British agent that is remarkable and untold completely. And the goods were sitting in a closet in Keswick, Ontario for many years. So that's our story. But again, we couldn't have got there without my lesson 2. Looking at these letters and looking at the second Lady Watson Watt, Jean Drew, Owen Sound, Ontario, married 3 times, her life story. We've been able to probe it the way you as genealogists do. You look at something this way and laterally and in every dimension, and you're able to find those relatives and find those connecting pieces to his story that have made his story so big and so broad. It's completely remarkable. We've enlisted, I'm not bragging, but high-level support from the National Archives of Scotland, the Royal Air Force Museum in England, a number of institutions in Britain who've looked at our work and said, wow, how do we get involved? Which, of course, for somebody like me is not a matter of commercial. It's just you're so excited to be part of something that's wonderful and something that's really cutting edge. And you maybe say to yourself, gee, I'm not really sure this is going to come my way again. You're going to maximize your opportunities to really get involved in a project that is meaningful to a lot of people. And so that is my second genealogical lesson. Something I'd always poo-pooed because of my affection for Michael Bliss. I now have come to respect as something that I really, really embraced. And I indicated earlier in the question from your fine chair, I've, in my spare time, have become avid with respect to my own family research. Tried to build upon my mom and dad did in southern Wales in 1990. They're researching the Davies name there in Merthyr Tydfil, which is a big coal mining area, and they found a bunch of amazing things. So it's become a passion of mine, and one of those, and sometimes the great passions are the ones that are unexpected, the ones you never saw. And it has really enlivened this work. And we now, our research team that I'm in charge of is maybe an exaggeration. They say I am. More the ringleader of a group of great souls. We have a wonderful fellow in Brecon named Steve Nicol, who is a retired Royal Marine Major. And he has researched, independent of anything that we've done, Watt's life in a way that is so remarkable over there. We've got the things here that kind of put the pieces and the puzzles together in his life. And as I say, we end up in a wonderful history project that has a powerful genealogical basis to it. Because without probing into his second Canadian wife's life, we wouldn't have what we have in terms of a book and a proposed series of documentaries and other sorts of multimedia work that you do in the digital age. But that... the other one. There we go. Okay. There she is. That's Jean, femme fatale of the Robert Watson Watt story. But she is the key. It's amazing. And that's through research. She became the portal that we were able to look at that no one in England would have even been aware of, because when Watt left England in 1952, he divorced his wife of 36 years. That didn't go well in the upper echelons of the society in which he hung at that time. He then received the biggest award in the history of England for inventions. He received £52,000 in 1952. It's about £1.6 million today, tax-free, as his contribution to the nation. And then he married Jean. And without, as I say, without her, we wouldn't have the story we have. And without kind of genealogical aspects and focus, we wouldn't have the story we have either. Now this picture was taken yesterday. I had the honor of speaking to the Oshawa Rotary Club and certain of the people with the Ontario regiments and other military people about remembrance. And I certainly don't propose to repeat that presentation today. But I would like to impart to you, as fellow lovers of history and people who have an engagement with your own histories, and by definition being here in Canada, Canadian history too. I'd like to pass on a few of my thoughts with respect to this word, remembrance, and what it means, what it especially means in the 100th anniversary of the Great War that prompted Remembrance Day and prompted the first ever real self-examination as a nation about what war meant. At least that's the way I would see the first Remembrance Days, right in the immediate aftermath of World War I. I would argue, kind of backwards, that the Afghan War is really an important trigger for all of us who are interested in history, going backwards as to why the history of World War I is important. I would suggest to you that because of the internet and because of digital media and because of the instantaneous nature of news, the Afghan War was the first time that we as Canadians got a sense of engagement with a conflict overseas in which we had a direct stake. As a little boy, and I turned 60 in December, so I certainly remember watching the Vietnam War unfold night after night on American television. But those are Americans. And as a young child, you maybe didn't understand the geopolitics of it, all that sort of thing. But for me, the Afghan War, and I'm not diminishing what our soldiers did in peacekeeping movements with the UN, Cyprus, Greece. We had soldiers deployed in Somalia, in Bosnia. Very good friend of mine named Doug Delaney, who's assisted us with our books, who's the Canadian Chair of War Studies now for the Canadian Research Council. He was a paratroop commander in Bosnia. Not in any way diminishing the contributions those people made. But Afghanistan was the first time that we as Canadians got to see with a certain immediacy what a war in the 21st century really looked like. And I'd argue it doesn't look very pretty. It certainly doesn't look very pretty in Afghanistan. I do not in any way dispute that there are other sides to what I'm about to say. I was never a fan of our engagement there. I don't believe it was the right thing for us to do. I don't believe the 154 people who got killed in Afghanistan deserve to go that way. And the 80 or so poor people who've taken their own lives as a result of having fought in that particular war, which on an objective basis seems to have achieved nothing, because Afghanistan to me seems like the same old autocratic hellhole that it was when we first went there in 2003. Those are my views, and I in no way ask anybody to necessarily agree or disagree with them. But Afghanistan did us a great service as a nation. It helped us understand that war has an immediacy. It's not wearing a poppy and watching a bunch of films from World War I or World War II to which we have no personal direct connection. We got to see how it was in the 21st century. We got to see what it was like for our soldiers to live in tough conditions. We got to see in some situations how a very, very determined, radicalized opponent was prepared to use jerry cans and tripwires to kill people, right? The IEDs that you hear about in Afghanistan, they're not complicated. All of us in this room could build one in an hour, no problem, right? They killed a lot of people. War, it brought home to us the immediacy. And I think the one positive thing that we can take from Afghanistan, it reinforced how important it is to remember what people do and what sacrifice really is. no matter where you stand in the ideology, no matter where you'd like one way or the other that particular conflict, I think it assisted us in really understanding what war is all about. And through that, it's refocused how we look at conflicts like World War I. None of us here had any engagement with World War I. I promise you, for guys like Arthur Manuel, World War I was hideous. It was beyond barbaric. Can we imagine today sending clouds of phosphogene, chlorine, or mustard gas across at our opponents and strangling them to death? That was the way it was. That was the war. Can we imagine, and what I'm giving you is a flat-out, straight fact taken from the British Army records, 350 people, soldiers, were executed by the British Army for desertion in World War I, shot by firing squad. The revisionist histories that have come along to look at why those men deserted for quote-unquote cowardice, at least half of them suffered today from what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder. If you as a soldier, as a commander, were to order people to shoot somebody with a medical condition like that, you would be tried as a war criminal. It was only 100 years ago. Right? And I'm not saying in any way that we get to use history to judge that particular situation in black and white terms. But it comes down to remembrance. And it comes down to my proposition that remembrance is not always about glory and valor and honor, right? Although those things are so important. They're wonderful, and they move us, and they're part of our humanity. Remembrance is also remembering the things that we didn't do very well as a human race, right? And certainly I would argue if you're executing people in dodgy circumstances for things called cowardice or desertion, those are things that we have to remember and really take a lesson from. So my view, as I say, about the whole study of history, especially military history, it has the fun side, the flippant side, the things I spoke about earlier that keep me young and moving forward in my life. But it also gives us a great opportunity to really, especially at this time of year, to remember what it is exactly that happened on the fields of battle, that we remember when we wear a poppy and we go to a cenotaph and we speak in situations like this, and to really, really think hard. It's the greatest anti-war example one could ever trot out would be World War I and the horrors that it was. But it really gives us a terrific opportunity to reflect on where we are and where we can take our own personal histories and our own personal studies and take them forward for the fun and the enjoyment that we get from them. I'm happy to answer any questions at all. As I say, it's an honor for me to speak to you tonight. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any question, pretty much. Sir.
Fine.
Yeah.
I would like to know what actually started World War I.
Oh, it's funny. It came up yesterday at the presentation. I can give it to you in literally 90 seconds. I think it's pretty historically accurate.
I've read a lot of books on it, but I've never ever caught the actual start of the war.
It's a great question because it's a great question because if you just were to read especially the Canadian media, which bought hugely into the whole Mother England imperialism and all that sort of stuff. I mean, New Berlin was renamed Kitchener. I mean, there was all sorts of sentiments about the Germans that were not that pleasant throughout 1914, 1918, which is ironic in our country because we had, if my memory's correct, between 1885 and 1910, when our federal government had a huge incentive to settle the prairies, right? Free land, right? And we had, I think of the million who came in that period, 250,000 were Germans, just saying. And, my mom's name, Keffer, right? I mean, it goes on and on. The German strain in our ancestry is powerful. But what happened essentially was this. In the late, go right back to 1870. One of the most brilliant of politicians, I would argue, in history, Otto von Bismarck, decided that he and Kaiser Wilhelm were going to unify Germany into a single state. It had been Prussia, it had been Saxe-Coburg, it had been Bavaria, it was all these scattered states, and Bismarck brought them all together, and he scared crap out of the French by doing that, because all of a sudden France saw, instead of a bunch of scattered little German states, you saw an imperial Germany headed by Bismarck, who was recognized as a genius, right? And so what does Bismarck do? Like every other Machiavellian leader at the time, he provokes a war with France and crushes them, right? And the first Franco-Prussian War was in 1870. And then the French regrouped, and Bismarck provoked them in another war, beat them again, 1871, solidified Germany. From that moment on, Germany decided it was going to be an imperial power, just like England, just like France. And in the 1880s, there was a phenomenon called the scramble for Africa, right? Africa was really the last kind of uncolonized continent, right? And the Germans were beating their fists and saying, hey, we want part of it too, Belgium as well. So you ended up with the Belgian Congo, the German West Congo, all the little different places. And as you may recall, what is now modern South Africa had a huge German influence over at that time. And all of a sudden now there's a rivalry between these great colonial powers, England, France, Germany. The Germans allied themselves with Austria-Hungary because it made sense. They were on their western border. And the Austrian-Hungarians, Vienna, at the end of the 19th century, I believe, was the world's largest city. It was maybe the world's richest city, 2 million people. It was the heart of the Habsburgs, the royal family that controlled Austria-Hungary for a long time. And all of a sudden, there's a great natural alliance. The Germans, Austria-Hungarians, right there. And the Austrian-Hungarians had beaten back the Ottomans, the Muslims who had invaded from the south for about 300 years. So they were very powerful. And England had its colonies. Of course, it even though it lost America, so good relations with the Americans, had Canada, and a far-flung India, huge colony. So you had Germany and England sort of ratcheting it up with their rivalry, and each one of them had a series of alliances with other nations. So in early 1914, when a Serbian anarchist named Princip, I can't think of his last name now, anyway, he jumped into a carriage of an Austrian archduke and shot him in the head and killed him. It triggered all of these alliances. They just went boom, boom, boom like a bunch of dominoes, and all of a sudden you had England and France facing Germany and Austria-Hungary. You can look back on it kind of as a revisionist history, and you'd say, gee, England was really more of a natural ally with Germany than not. Kaiser Wilhelm was Queen Victoria's grandson, among other connections, right? And Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, was German. Like, it goes on and on. And you can speak, as I've done with a number of German historians, it is kind of a fluke of history. That's the way it worked. But that's how it happened. It was more of an accident of history than anything planned. And I've made the point in other presentations that you can feel tremendous justification, I would argue, in the fact that our nation and everybody that was on the Allied side stood against something as abominable as the Nazi German movement. I'm not so sure you can make the same principled moral argument arguing about World War I.
No.
And to your point, even worse, the slaughter that went on in World War I and the absolute barbarism that one would associate. I mean, our guy Manuel describes like just slaughter. I mean, you're sending wave of men against certain death. You know that these guys are, it's just a matter of how many.
They were climbing out of the trenches right into
gunfire. The way Manuel describes what happened at Beaumont Hamel when the Royal Newfoundland Regiment got slaughtered was that there were all sorts of logistical problems. They hadn't cut, instead of, like, the barbed wire didn't have the big enough cuts in it, so that when the guys going over the top were wounded and trying to get back, they're running into people who are still going over the top, and it was just horrible. I've got the diaries I secured from a German historian about 3 years ago. A Bavarian volunteer regiment were the machine gunners that were facing off against the Newfoundlanders, and literally they couldn't believe that they had men marching towards them in formation because they were going to get killed, and that's exactly what happened. And so World War I has that horror to it. Manuel says in his account of Passchendaele, 310,000 people on all sides were killed and not enough ground to bury themselves in. I mean, a horrible, awful slaughter that I would argue that today is almost unfathomable in its scope, right? And World War I, as I say, has that kind of random horror to it. World War II is definable. Nazi Germany was not you cannot make anything that was done under Nazism pretty by history. And so you had two wars that are so different. But World War I really was just a series of alliances that fell into place, and all of a sudden you're Canada, because we were quasi-colony in 1914, were bound to serve. The Newfoundlanders were a colony. They were obligated to serve, and there really wasn't a lot of choice in the matter in terms of what we did.
Just
Sure.
just a couple of things to add to what you've said. If you are interested in the cause of World War I, a book that I have read, which is highly readable, written by a Canadian from University of Toronto, Mark McMillan. It's called The War That Ended Peace. Excellent book, very definitive, very well researched, and certainly explains the causes of the First War. She wrote another book called Paris 1919, which is the definitive book about the Versailles Treaty, which laid all the roots, of course, for the Second World War.
Right. Yeah.
Both by Canadians and both excellent reads.
Yeah, there are some. Thank you. That there are some terrific Canadian histories of World War I and World War II. A gentleman I mentioned, Doug Delaney, a friend from Royal Military College, he published a book last year. If you're interested in reading an intense military history that is very detailed, but really has remarkable scope, Doug makes the argument that Vimy Ridge was not the most important battle that Canadian forces fought in World War I. He makes the argument, with a number of other scholars, that it was actually a place called Hill 70, which is just outside of Lens, Belgium. And he argues, without without any doubt about history, Currie, General Currie, Lens was the first battle, not Vimy Ridge people think it was, but no. Lens was the first battle. It was a Canadian planned and Canadian attacked mission. Currie was a meticulous planner, and the casualties at Hill 70 were not quite as horrific as at Vimy Ridge. But Doug makes the really intriguing argument, hard to beat the force of logic. When the Canadian forces captured Vimy Ridge, they held it for 10 months. It was just they remained on top of it, and that was it. Hill 70 was counterattacked 21 times by the German forces, because Hill 70 drew about 250,000 German forces away from Flanders to deal with what they thought was going to be the British Expeditionary Force invasion going the other way. And so Doug and his colleagues make the argument that it's a more important battle. But if you're interested, it's called Capturing Hill 70. It's just an amazing study of every single issue about that battle. And if you ever want a proof that Currie was probably the most brilliant general in World War I on either side, you'd read that book and you'd come to that conclusion. And they say there have been many terrific histories in this country that have been written about World War I and II. There's one, I'm trying to think of the name of it now, what many historians call the greatest feat of arms in World War II, Ortona, on the east side of Sicily in 1943, where two Canadian regiments faced off against a crack German paratroop unit. And horrible, 2,500 men killed and another 2,000 wounded in a week. They're going literally room to room in one of those horrible battles in 1943, as the Germans were sent in to staunch the flood of the Allied advance along the east coast of Sicily. But it's gripping. I mean, and one point I meant to make about remembrance, kind of tripped my mind here. The other thing we got to look at, sometimes is there was another side to these conflicts. There were German guys and Austrian guys, Japanese guys, and men and women who died in these conflicts. Some years, well, actually I should say two parts that I just leave you with. a number of years ago in my basketball coaching adventures in Vienna, my daughter and I walked into a small church just offside the main square in downtown Vienna. If you ever had the chance to go to Vienna, and if you're a student of history as we all are, Vienna was sort of the root of the Counter-Reformation movements in the late 1600s, early 1700s, which I paraphrase meaning the Catholics got tired of having the Protestants expand, and they were going to build churches, damn it, that were way bigger and way better and way more beautiful than anything. And the Counter-Reformation churches of Austria and southern Germany are exactly that. They're beautiful. Where there isn't gold, there's silver. Where there isn't silver, there's bronze, and they glow and they shine, and they're just awesome, beautiful places. What they call the Steffi, St. Stephen's in downtown Vienna, is stunning. But in the corner of this church, I think it's St. Michael's, there's a plaque set against the corner. It'd be like going upstairs in this church, and like in the back row of the pews, there's just this little discreet stone tablet set in the wall. My German is not perfect, but I was able to read it. 1939, 1945, and it was an Austrian volunteer panzer tank unit that had mobilized after Hitler annexed Austria in 1938. I looked up the regiment, and almost all of them were killed. Either they were captured and killed by the Russians after Stalingrad, or they froze to death on the retreat from Russia in 1942. So you say to yourself, the average age of those fellows was 20 and a half. Right? Whatever anybody says about whether you volunteered or were conscripted or anything, it doesn't really matter. At that point, the biggest army in the world had just entered your country. It seems to me you didn't have a whole lot of choices to what your real decisions might be with respect to enlisting. But I often think of that because they had mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters just like everybody else. And I don't think remembrance is about victory. Remembrance is about truly remembering what people's sacrifice might have been. And their sacrifice, I'm sure, was just as great as anybody else's. You carve the ideologies aside. Well, last summer, my wife and I had down the Danube River in Germany, and we went to a place called Regensburg, which was laid flat by the Allies in World War II. It's 5% standing. It's been completely rebuilt. But the one place that was not touched in the Allied bombardment and invasion was the World War I memorial that had been erected in Regensburg for the German army. It's touching, and it's moving to go there because somebody puts poppies just like all around the place every day of the year. And there's a very quiet tribute to the fact that in this relatively small German town, 700 guys were killed during World War I. And people continue on to their memories, continue on to the fact that they served their nation. And whether we agree or disagree with respect to the ideology, as I say, becomes irrelevant. There they are, this beautiful memorial, 100 years old, right in the bank of the river. And it stands the same testament as anything else does to the fact that humans sometimes fail in the way that we settle conflicts. Yeah.
Could we go back to the radar, Watt's radar? And
Sure.
I didn't realize it was around that early.
Oh yeah.
But I did see a little while ago about a bombardment in London with Zeppelins
Yes.
in 1915.
Yep.
It didn't last very long because the Zeppelins were hydrogen easily inflamed, I guess, by rifle shots.
Don't make something out of hydrogen. That's a lesson to learn. Helium works better. Yeah. Inert gases, always good. Yeah.
I wondered how long it took to get them on ships in World War II because my dad was a radar operator on frigate.
It's interesting you say that. Robert Watson Watt, our protagonist in our forthcoming book, Watt was a genius of what's called, you may have heard the expression, operational research. It wasn't just theory. He would do it himself, or he would have people sit on airplanes and aircraft and watch pilots work and move and how they worked in tight quarters. And from that, they were able to develop onboard radar systems by functional onboard radar systems that helped detect German night bombing by early 1941. They had at least rudimentary
These
onboard.
are all the land towers you're talking about.
Oh, these are on board the aircraft. By early
in a
41,
plane.
yeah. By early 41, Watt set in motion a tremendous development in England, technological development. And by early 41, the Beaufort fighters, they were a 4-engined kind of fighter bomber. They had a rudimentary onboard system. But the other application of radar that was decisive in the sea battles was sonar, maritime equivalent. And by the end of the war, for the Brits, probably 25% of their submarine kills were attributable to radar. There is no underestimating the contributions that radar made to warfare. As I said earlier, England would have been obliterated had not radar existed.
My dad liked it because on the way to Vermont, those the tubes in the equipment kept him nice and warm up there.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, the early radar systems were kind of large and bulky. Yeah, but no, that's why we're so thrilled about this project, because it really allows us to offer insights about somebody that have never been offered before, which is always kind of cool. But there is no underestimating the course of warfare, the course of our lives today. I'll leave you with a personal anecdote. 1954, my late dad was a first-year cadet at Royal Military College of Canada. And he used to tell a story, way before I knew about this history, of how they were waiting as first-year cadets for a special lecture from the man who developed radar, Sir Robert Watson Watt, who got popped by the Port Hope police for speeding in 1954. It's all documented. Using his own device. And Watt came and explained why he was late to the class and said, "You won't believe this." And it's crazy that in my own little personal life history, that's going to be replayed in our book next year. But it's the truth. Yeah.
In World War I, was there not an issue with the Ross rifles in Currie?
That was Sir Sam Hughes. Yeah, in World War I, Sir Sam Hughes was the Minister of Militia. Hughes, if you ever have a chance to read anything about him, and I don't desecrate his memory, but Hughes is one of the more intriguing characters in our Canadian history. He, born Lindsay, he was a Orangeman big time, I'm not sure the title, the Grand Marshal, but the head of the Orange Lodge of Ontario. And a book we've got coming out later next year called Stuart's War. Three brothers from Millbrook, Ontario. We have a collection of letters, about 120, they sent home from the front World War I. They were all Orange Irish guys, fight for as long as King George needs us, loyalty to the core, right? And that was Hughes, I should say. Hughes was bound and determined that Canada would have its own rifle, would have its own boots, would have its own uniforms, have its own everything. And he got this rifle made by an English guy, and it was still used in Korea as a sniper rifle in the 50s. It was a terrific rifle in terms of competition, in terms of its accuracy over distance, all that stuff, except for one small, tiny, infinitesimal problem with the front in World War I. It didn't really work very well when it was wet outside. Right? And yeah, in any sort of moisture. And the problem, again, you get amazing stories in World War I with logistics, right? We had the Ross rifle. Ross was the Englishman who developed it. It's a 303 caliber weapon. And somebody in the Canadian leadership thought that we could economize by using 303 caliber bullets from the British, who had the Lee Enfield 303, which was theirs. They were slightly different in size, and in a wet weather in the Somme and in Flanders, when the bullets expanded slightly, they got in the Ross and they would jam, right? There are some really sobering, again, revisionist histories that have been published in the last 10 years that suggest that perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 Canadian men died because the Ross malfunctioned and they got popped, right? And Hughes, who one never speaks completely ill of the dead, but you can make a pretty good case that he was a little different, a little 15 degrees off center. He made an order to the Canadian troops that they could not, when they saw a dead British Tommy, they were not allowed to take his weapon That was a rule that was breached all the time. Canadian soldiers would ditch their Ross rifle and grab the .303 all the time because they were afraid of dying.
Well, my grandfather brought his Lee Enfield back.
Yeah, it wasn't a Canadian issue, I assure you that. Well, they had the Ross. No, no. If you have a Lee Enfield .303, it was taken from a British soldier. I promise you. Yeah. And thank God they did, because maybe your grandfather wouldn't have lived if he hadn't.
And Hughes didn't get a kickback. There was no financial thing. It was just something.
It was a weird form of Canadian patriotism. You know, we're better than that. He also developed, not to bore you, but he developed a shovel, an amazing shovel, a trench tool that had a hole in it, so you could actually use it over your face and look at the enemy. And the Germans figured out pretty soon that their bullets would pierce that and kill people. Beautiful. Lovely idea. Thank you, Sir Sam. Attaboy. You know, that way the boots that he had made were made by, there was some cronyism with respect to his suppliers in Canada. It was just awful. And Hughes, and the war didn't end well for him because his son Garnet didn't get promoted to be a chief of staff with Curry, and there was a huge political blow over that too. Like it goes, yeah, the histories are intriguing. But if you do have a chance to read about Sir Sam Hughes, Lindsay's finest, and he's buried in Lindsay Cemetery. If you ever drive to Lindsay, just south of town, the great big one, just on the south end of Lindsay, he's buried in there. A proud Lindsay man to the day he died. Not necessarily our greatest wartime leader.
Yeah, my other grandfather apparently knew him.
Yeah. Been an Orangeman, probably.
I
Not that's
don't
bad.
know what he said about him.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the histories, they say a lot about Sir Sam. Not too glowing. Sir. Yes.
I just didn't quite catch a comment you made almost at the beginning about there are very few diaries or war accounts of prisoners of war.
Yes, I am. Yep.
That's from First World War.
Yeah, from North America. That's right.
From North
And the reason being, the Americans didn't enter the war, not in force, until early 1918, so they didn't, I mean, this sounds blunt, but they didn't have a chance to get captured in the same numbers. And the Canadian, most of the Canadian accounts of any prisoner of war stuff were written by officers, and the officers tended to have it pretty easy, and they tend to be involved in prisoner exchanges. There's a famous book called A Guest of the Kaiser, written by a fellow who ultimately used that book to raise money for war bonds at the end of the war in Toronto. And I know that our guy Manuel would have hated him on sight, because the story he tells about the prison camps of the officers were in was not his experience. Manuel spent 17 months in a prisoner of war camp, and we're pretty confident it's the only account that actually deals with that situation.
And that's in contrast to World War II.
Oh yeah, where there's all kinds of stories, and The Great Escape, and other great stories like that. It was a different, because World War I started off as a gentleman's war in many respects. I mean, there's a famous story, a famous true story. Christmas 1914, the German and English officers getting together and having a game of soccer out in the no man's lands, and that went on, and that was absolutely documented. A guy that I know in Germany wrote that book. That happened. That would never have happened in World War II.
When did the tanks come in, the British tanks?
The first British tank was developed by the Navy, of all places, in early 1915. But the really successful tanks in World War I were the French Renaults. They were basically a mobile gun platform. But unlike the British tanks that went 3 miles an hour, the Renaults were the breakthrough. They could actually move at 9 miles an hour, dual machine guns on top. And the story about them is George Patton, who became a great leader in the Second World War. Patton saw the tanks. He was a cavalryman. He saw the tanks in operation in 1917 and said, that is the future of warfare. And Patton became a tank guy right from that moment.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Very intriguing. I love the glimpses of the future publications. And
my publisher would say, buy them, please.
of course he
You'll
would.
update us when they're available?
Absolutely. I'll be very pleased to do that. Yeah, we've got a big campaign, a promotional campaign starting in about 3 weeks with respect to the Watts and Watts story, which is kind of a multi-dimensional film, book, and some things. We shot a promotional video last week in the Carnegie Library in Whitby, and but coincidentally, Watt was educated through the Carnegie funds in Scotland to get to university. It was kind of neat that we have a Carnegie Library in Whitby that would go to the same fund.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
law office, is it?
Yeah, my lovely wife is a partner there, yes. I have some connections that fine building. But I was also, I was saying that, like, as a little boy, I was a member of the Whitby, the Children's Lending Library on the bottom floor
And
there.
that's where I got books for my classroom.
Yeah.
Before it was a law office.
Yeah, it's been an institution for a long time in Whitby, 1913, yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Please, thank you. My pleasure. I think that's mine,
Got it?
yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
That looks pretty good, doesn't it?
There we go.
Okay. See how far behind we are.
Yes, break.
Now, we've run out of time, so Steve's mini presentation we're gonna do in December or January?
Bring and brag.
He'll do a bring and brag on this one. Okay. Upcoming meetings, we've got the DNA group on November 20th. We've got upcoming meetings. December's gonna be the bring and brag and the Christmas potluck, so bring cookies or squares or whatever, and we'll all enjoy that and have wonderful time. Just networking.
Are you leading
Okay.
the choir?
Pardon?
The choir? The choir. Christmas
choir?
carols.
Christmas carols? You want me to lead Christmas carols? Oh, no. I think we'd scare away members. No, we will supply drinks and everybody else can bring the goodies. January, please note, it's not going to be the 1st of January. I really don't think that's a good day for a meeting. Might be a few hangovers involved. So we're going to meet on January the 8th and do our usual brick wall buster panel. Steve has a request though. If you have a brick wall in your research, he'd like you to write it up and get it to him now. Because he would like to do a little pre-work on it before January. So don't forget to get, just pick one brick wall and send it to Steve. He'd like to be overwhelmed, right? He'd like to have at least one or two, right?
Oh, we're already at one.
We have one.
Already at one.
Okay. So give him a few more to work on.
That's right.
Let's keep him busy. And in February, we're going to have Lisa from the Oshawa Museum again. I think it's going to be something like a virtual tour of their holdings. So that'll be interesting. Oh, yes. Let's not forget the 50-50 draw. So get your tickets out. And while Sheila's coming up, I've got some breaking news on DNA testing. Just announced this last weekend at the MyHeritage Conference in Oslo, Norway? Norway. Apparently MyHeritage, and there's no timeline on this, is going to be working with another company that is not named yet, where they're going to accept envelopes and stamps to extract DNA from your ancestors. So if you have some, yeah. Now there's no indication of what the price is going to be.
I have to see them lick the stamps.
Well, if you're pretty sure that if they're writing on the envelope, I think you can pretty well. So if you have some envelopes or stamps, no hair, hair's no good. This is the next thing coming in DNA, is to be able to do some of your deceased ancestors. And I've got an envelope that I know my dad wrote, and I know he licked the envelope, and I know he got the stamp because he sent it to my sister at guide camp, and my mother was the camp nurse, so she didn't address the envelope, which is what she always did. So as soon as I'm sure that this is gonna work, they're still working out some of the stuff. I have an article if anybody wants to have a quick look at it. Everybody's excited about this one, and so am I. So Sheila,
Okay, we have $11.50 for the 50/50 prize, plus the second prize of homemade raspberry jam.
ooh,
Your own number. Okay, last three numbers are 0, 6, 5.
I got 4. 64.
oh, I can't believe that.
Good job. That's that lucky ticket, right?
Yes,
There you go.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I could maybe afford maybe a couple of coffees that were at Tim Hortons.
And you pick for the jam.
Okay. Okay, let's see if it ends in a 4. Nope, sorry, Steve.
052. Yep, 052. Be right back.
Great, okay.
You get 2 prizes in one day.
Okay, well, our resolution didn't work between my computer and this computer. But there are our that's our contact information. That first one, I think, is our website.
Durham.ogs.on.ca.
Yes. So, for our website, just take that out and replace it with a dot. And do you ever go back and look at our YouTube videos? Who looks at our YouTube videos?
I've seen a couple.
Well, go on YouTube and put in Durham Region Branch OGS and click on the first thing that comes up. Click on it, and we've got how many? 20 YouTube videos up there from our meetings over the last 2 or 3 years.
But we've seen them, because we were here.
We were here, but if you weren't here, or maybe you want to hear it again, most of our speakers are there on our YouTube channel, and you should go look. So that's it, guys. Good night, safe home, and we'll see you in December. Bring lots of goodies.